Your frame rate can hurt your damage output. You can't play that job at that latency. Never cast a healing spell. Ever. In Final Fantasy XIV, there are a lot of ways to optimize your performance. A lot of the time, when these ways to optimize are discussed, they tend to be presented in a rather extreme way, like as if the sky will fall if you don't do it just right. But things aren't so black and white or strict when it really comes to it. I want to go over some of the more or less extreme optimization tricks, strategies, or methods, explain how impactful they may be, and perhaps compare them to some more mundane things you can do that actually are much more impactful for, the average player perhaps. Number 1. Your frame rate can affect your DPS. This one might sound like hyperbole, or even like a meme, but while the amount of impact it can make is rather minor, it can impact your rotation in more tangible ways, which is likely the reason why it is exaggerated a bit more, despite the damage difference it really causes. So, how can frame rate affect your DPS? Well, in Final Fantasy XIV, while you have features like action buffering, which helps send your action command at the earliest possible moment, the game, for some reason, can only send such a command on a valid gameplay frame on the user's side. In my Mythbuster series, I've talked about how the animation lock works in detail, but when it comes down to the milliseconds, frame delay also plays a factor. Let's say, for the sake of an example, that you use a GZD and want to weave something at the earliest possible moment, and that ultimately your animation lock is 0.64 seconds for this example. If you play on a perfectly consistently stable 60 FPS frame rate, then while 0.64 seconds after the GZD is the moment you would be able to weave something, if we say the GZD was used on frame 0, then frame 38 is 0.6333 seconds, while frame 39 is 0.65 seconds. Meaning that while your animation lock was 0.64 seconds, due to frame delay, an additional 0.01 seconds was added. Does this matter? No, probably not. You will probably be able to weave the thing as needed on time over the course of the fight anyway. However, note that if your frame rate instead was 120 FPS, then frame 77 would be 0.64166 seconds, meaning that simply being on this higher frame rate would allow you to weave 0.00834 seconds faster. Again, does that matter? Probably not. Again, you will probably get those OGZDs out just fine. But what if it was a GZD? Let's say you have a GZD of exactly 2.50 and a perfectly stable 60 FPS frame rate. In this case, GZD 1 would come out on frame 0 and GZD 2 would come out on frame 150, exactly 2.50 seconds later. However, if your frame rate was even remotely unstable, or for instance, more like a consistent 59 FPS, in that case, frame 147 would be at time 2.4915 seconds, too early, while frame 148 would be 2.5085 seconds, meaning by your frame rate alone, your GZD is closer to 2.51 rather than 2.50. Is that a problem? Again, probably not really, but this can be one of the explanations why, if you've used the Civanalysis website, that it sometimes clocks your GZD at 2.51 rather than 2.50. It can also be because of other delays that are unrelated to frame delay. A way some players overcome this possible delay is to simply aim for a GZD of 2.49 instead, which, for any frame rate of 50 or above, will ensure that the GZD goes out somewhere between 2.49 seconds and 2.5 seconds after the previous one. But then again, how much does it matter? 0.01 second lost per GZD. Well, let's try to estimate that. In a 10-minute fight, you would be able to fit precisely 240 2.5 second GZDs. If your GZD was practically 2.51 for the entire fight, this number would change to 239 GZDs, meaning that you would lose exactly 1 GZD in a 10-minute fight with 0 downtime. Assuming a somewhat average potency GZD is lost this way, we can probably expect this to be somewhere in the ballpark of 0.1 to maybe 0.2% damage lost, if even that. Probably not even that. This number is so low that unless you are already performing your entire rotation perfectly, worrying about your frame delay should be way further down your list of priorities, as you will also lose a whole GZD in a 10-minute fight if your GZD sits idle for more than 2.5 seconds. And this can sometimes happen for less perfect players just when having to deal with mechanics, whether it is a melee having to run out range or a caster poorly planning their mobility options. Which is to say, a very mundane optimization that perfectly contrasts frame delay is the much more simple concept known as ABC, Always Be Casting, which predates Final Fantasy XIV's mere existence by possibly over half a decade. What this means is to simply always keep your GZD spinning. A way I personally like to describe it is that it is always better to do something than nothing. Technically, even with its downsides, we can probably agree that a black mage using Scathe is better than if they actually did nothing. Genuinely, one of the most effective ways to improve your performance is to always do something in a fight. No matter how small, don't waste time if possible. Number 2. Crit is God! Okay, this one is definitely an exaggeration, but also a bit funny, right? Due to the way it scales, critical hit is, without contest, the best stat to stack for damage output in Final Fantasy XIV. Sure, yes, it is less predictable than Determination, but on average, crit stacking will beat Determination. This is further amplified by the fact that most Savage boss fights go on for long enough that most jobs will see their strongest attacks show up enough times that they tend to reach the average amount of crits, while the fights are still short enough that you can still get really lucky sometimes. For instance, with crit stacking, you can expect your crit chance to be somewhere around 25%, more from buffs sometimes, but let's focus on the 25%. If a fight is long enough for you to see your 2-minute cooldown attack 4 times, so less than 8 minutes but more than 6 minutes, then you can expect, on average, 1 of them to crit. Getting less than that, 0 is the unlucky result, while you have the opportunity to be so lucky as to see 2, 3 or even all 4 crit on the other side. This becomes more complicated if we also include direct hit, and typically you might not expect your best attacks to direct crit like this in every fight, on average. However, the important part is that critical hit scales so much better than the other damage increasing stats that, at a certain point, the fact that the different stats amplify each other by being additional multipliers fly out the window because crit scales better alone. I have a whole separate video on this topic if you're interested, link in the description. However, a lot of the time when we do discuss optimal stats, unless it is specifically about piety, which offers 0 in terms of damage gain, the margins are typically pretty slim. To give a simpler example of this, that I already kind of alluded to, is the fact that having a more even split between direct hit and determination is, on average, considered more effective than having a lot of just one. For clarification, if we assume you are the luckiest person on the planet, then having a very small amount of direct hit and a very high amount of determination would be better since, you could just be lucky. But in the average case, let's say you had 2026 points of stats you could distribute. If you could put it all in determination, you would get 10.2% more damage output. If you put it all in direct hit, you get 10% average damage gain. Dissemination scales slightly better than direct hit. However, if you split it evenly to get 5.1% determination and 5% gain from direct hit, these two would multiply together. Determination increases the damage of your non-direct hitting attacks and your direct hitting attacks, making for a greater whole. However, while we say it is optimal to keep them as close to even as possible, with determination slightly ahead due to its better scaling, this exact example leads to a combined gain of 10.355% damage gained, meaning that you would gain 0.155% more damage than if you had just gone all in on determination, which itself is unlikely due to how gear options work. 0.155%. Almost the same as the frame delay potential loss of 0.01 seconds, eh? And while the margins of going all in on crit are ever so slightly bigger, for the majority of players, simply having a decent set of equipment and focusing on playing better will be far, far more impactful than worrying about the slim margins of stat optimization. This is especially true in the case of healers, where the fact determination increases healing done while direct hit does not could actually matter, when, again, the damage gain margins are that small. Which, a bit similar to the frame delay example, indicates that unless you have already fully realized your damage potential from a practical point of view, that will always be far more impactful than optimizing on an entirely statistical perspective. Although, obviously, everything helps. Number 3. You can't play that job on insert ping here, MS. This one tends to come from a place of trying to help each other, but also sometimes excludes certain jobs from viability in certain latencies because the job quote-unquote requires, say, double weaving to perform its burst optimally, even if it is playable without that. Of course, as you can probably surmise from the previous examples, playing optimally always requires you to have the best latency. However, the margin for how high a ping you can get away with while still playing a job mostly right or well enough tends to be a significant step away from what is considered required for some jobs. To take an average, before any latency is accounted for, your animation lock would average around 0.64 seconds, although this of course varies a bit and seems to tend lower than that. In addition to this, there are tools that can reduce the effective rotational animation lock to have near 0 ms, if not an animation lock below 0.64 altogether. Some players will use these kinds of tools, which, at their most extreme, can indeed enable triple weaving on a GCD of 2.5 without clipping. However, fortunately, there is no job that requires this to be played optimally. It is safe to say, however, that most jobs need to be able to single weave to be reasonably functional, and some jobs may find it difficult to work at full capacity without double weaving. To that end, it is safe to assume your average job with a GCD of 2.5 baseline should be capable of double weaving with as much as around 180 ms latency. The faster jobs on a GCD of about 2.12, Ninja and Viper comes to mind, should be able to double weave on a much leaner around 65 ms. With Monk, on a GCD of typically around 1.93 or 1.94 optimally, is effectively living proof that the 0.64 second animation lock tends lower, as while they should only be able to double weave on 6 ms or less, I'm able to do it well enough on about 20. Taking a step further, certain jobs have bursts of high-speed 1.5 second GCDs, notably Machinist and Reaper, and they should be able to single weave during these bursty periods on as high as 100 ms. A further detail to this is that what makes Machinists need to single weave during their speedy hypercharges is to make sure you don't overcap on checks. However, by the time you can hold 3 charges, a suboptimal but functional alternative is to simply make sure you have 0 charges and long cooldown time left of both checks before using hypercharge, after which you may be able to perform the hypercharge with 0 weaves without any loss there, which would at least make the job functional at the latencies that other 2.5 GZD jobs can play effectively at. But those breakpoints I just listed are effectively the limits of what latencies can work the job mostly optimally, aside from the machinist example of course. If we were to accept that we just can't double weave, then most jobs with less than 9 weaves in a 20-second window would still be mostly playable, reasonably close to their maximum potential. With only single weaving, a 2.50 GZD job would be playable on upwards of over 500 ms, which arguably, at that point, you most likely have bigger problems than your rotation being awkward, as buffs will start to show up weirdly late, mechanics will strike out of turn, and so on. For the faster jobs at 212, about 400 ms should still be functional, although neither Ninja nor Viper really work with just single weaving. Monk at 1.93 would also mostly work at around 300 ms. Now, the problem with making this concession is that most guides are fully assuming you can double weave, so you will have to home cook your rotations some to make that happen. But what this comes back to is that while a handful of jobs just don't work very well past a certain latency, we're often quick to write off jobs that could work just because they aren't working optimally. And finally, number 4, openers and burst windows. If you've watched or read almost any Dawntrail job guide, you have almost certainly been exposed to this. Every job has an optimal opening sequence of actions, an opener, and often also have optimal ways to perform their burst using their cooldowns every minute, especially every other minute. For some jobs, this comes somewhat naturally. For example, with a paladin that just has to press their strongest attacks during their own damage cooldown, and the only somewhat unintuitive part is making sure that aligns with where other players use their damage buffs. For other jobs, like Samurai, it feels a lot more like having to actively adjust your playstyle around the things other players have when optimizing. Timing your strongest attacks with a raid buff, you can't be sure to know exactly when it appears unless you are in an optimizing scenario. But Samurai, just as an example, still have enough things aligning with a burst every minute that while it takes extra work to get it just right, you can still see the skeleton of a burst around the cooldowns that do come up on the minute. And then there are jobs like Machinists that have enough options to perform their burst that whatever seems intuitive might be a completely different universe from what is considered optimal. Now, exactly how impactful it is to perform an optimal opener and perfectly burst every minute, especially every even minute, is a bit difficult to put an exact price on, as some jobs burst better than others. However, the significance of doing this also increases with the consistency of which the party as a whole actually bursts as a team. Which is a somewhat roundabout way of saying that the less organized the party you are in is, the less crucial it is to perform these 2-minute bursts perfectly or effectively, as it will matter less, especially for jobs with less or no personal damage buffs. And for a more mundane way you can optimize for comparison, I'm not joking when I say just using your cooldowns while weaving properly at all is a perfectly reasonable starting point to improve your play. To give a rough example, let's say that you are a Dragoon and you really want all of your cooldowns to fit just right inside the burst. So, for some reason, you decide to not use any cooldowns, unless they overlap with at least Lance Charge and Geishkaku. This means all 1-minute cooldowns will work out just fine, and 2-minute cooldowns like Battle Litany will also work out fine. However, you will lose out on a jump and mirage dive every minute, which adds up to a combined 780 potency, which is about as much as 2 whole GZDs lost every minute. So why are we here discussing frame delays? To take the example a bit further, let's say that now you choose to use jump and mirage dive on cooldown, and this somehow leads to them always missing the burst window. but now you went from using 1 jump per minute to 2. Before, you got one 121% jump and mirage dive set, also boosted by other raid buffs sometimes. Now, you at the very least get 2 100% jumps and mirage dives. This kind of comparison is also the same reason why it is often better to use a cooldown on cooldown than sit on it to make it align with the burst window, as unless you know for sure, it will take a long fight to recoup the damage lost from possibly losing out on a use of the cooldown. And the way this damage is recouped is through the uses that are buffed by, well, raid buffs, which a lot of the time will only be a couple of them. In other words, while performing an optimal opener and optimal burst is, well, optimal, performing a thoughtful opener that at least makes sense and using your cooldowns instead of sitting on them is already much, much better than being too caught up in what is optimal and wasting resources as a result. Do you know of some optimization tricks that players can get a bit too caught up in, detracting from the parts that actually matter for, well, the average player? I probably already left one for you at the very start of the video that I didn't address. I would love to hear about them in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, the fact actions are sent on the next viable frame probably much better explains why macros play one line of the macro in Final Fantasy XIV per frame. This means that it effectively takes 15 frames of gameplay to fully run a 15-line macro, which can take more or less time depending on how high your frame rate is.